gained like, I don't know, 50 followers in the last 3 days on Herman, yeah. I don't know. I think your sturgeon distancing thing is helping that. Your retweet of my sturgeon distancing. Half a Herman. No, that came from. Well, no, Herman is the first one who put out half a Herman and sturgeon distancing.
Oh, and then Peter commented on it.
Yeah.
That's how that worked out.
No, I'm not doing that account. I can't even do my own Twitter account anymore. Like, there's no time to do, like,
I get called the state treasurer.
By who?
Somebody on Facebook. They're like, whoever runs the ODFW Facebook account is the state treasurer.
Wow.
Like, oh, that's gonna go to my dad.
Well, now that all family together.
I had an interesting discussion with a guy
Yes. Please say refuge. Been through this whole pet peeve of mine. I hate the phrase. Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, we'll start with this one. Let's start with the that's on. And take it from there. Okay. Okay.
2 minutes out. Wait, how did that get turned back on? And is the title slide up on the thing now, Bob? Okay.
Chuck, can you see the comment box, the chat box on the right hand side?
No,
Are you logged into our?
actually, can you text me that?
Alright, I'm going live right now.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our virtual public meeting on Columbia River Coldwater Refuges and Thermal Angling Sanctuaries, the update we're having. My name is Tucker Jones. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the Columbia River Program Manager. Thanks for joining us tonight. This is the first one of these I've done, so bear with me if there's any problems or awkwardness. Thank you. Briefly going to have go over a short outline for what we're going to cover tonight. We'll have a process status update for where we are within Oregon. Part of this also, please note that we will take questions at the end of the presentation. So if you could save those till then before you type them in, and then hopefully staff here will be able to answer them. We're going to cover some background on why we're here and what's going on. A review of some of the EPA work on Coldwater refuge areas that sort of kick-started this whole concept and idea, where we are at in the Columbia River process, and then some potential management actions. With the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of our inability right now to have in-person meetings, we've decided to deal with 2020 through temporary rules. I just want that to be understood up front. We will reschedule in-person meetings and bring this to the Commission for permanent rulemaking consideration after things calm down and we can have a full process. We feel that this is really the only way to provide a fair, open, and transparent process for all members of the public for whom this might be a topic of interest. That being said, it is our intent to use the information and what we're going to show tonight as the foundation for potential fishery actions for us to take this year. All right, a little bit of deep background. Hopefully everybody knows, but in case you don't, salmon and steelhead generally require cold rivers and streams. They evolved here in the Northwest and in the Columbia River. And they've historically thrived here. even though sometimes temperatures in these rivers, which span into interior basins like the Columbian Snake, can be above optimal temperatures at some times and locations. That being said, there have been changes to the Columbia River that have altered the spatial and temporal thermalscape, and that can increase exposure to suboptimal temperatures. And largely when I say those changes, we're talking about the construction and continued operation of the federal Columbia River power system. The impact of this increased exposure on spawning success is uncertain, but it's likely a variable within many in the function that impacts that spawning success. Why are we here specifically now? We are living in a warming world. Over the last half centuries at Bonneville Dam, this graph here is showing average August temperatures there. They have increased over time. We expect to see increasing water temperatures and river temperatures over the next half century as well. So climate change is a real and pressing issue, and we're going to have to deal with that. We've also seen a declining trend in summer steelhead over the last 20 years. So this is also something that we need to be paying attention to and trying to take steps to address. Just should note that although there is a sort of corresponding upward trends in temperatures and downward trends in those fish numbers, I think it's also important to remember that correlation does not equal causation. So they're not necessarily related here. But these are two things that are having us take a closer look and driving some of the actions that we are considering right now. I have mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency has done some of this Coldwater Refuge work throughout the basin. Some of what we're going to be doing is pulled from the final draft report that ODFW did provide comments on to the EPA in December. This slide here is simply to point out that there are approximately 191 tributaries that enter the main stem Columbia River between its juncture with the Snake River and the Pacific Ocean. The different colored dots on this graph indicate temperature differentials between the tributary and the Columbia River main stem. Green dots indicate areas where temperatures are about 2 degrees cooler Celsius than the main stem, and purple dots are where you would see 4 degrees or colder Celsius in the main stem. Red and orange dots indicate areas that are actually warmer than main stem temperatures. These cold water areas that set up provide the potential for cold water refuge for at least part of the summer. Of those 191 tributaries, the EPA identified 12 potential primary areas, of which 6 happen to be in Oregon. Other people have done some work on this issue as well. In an October 2018 report to the EPA, the Lower Columbia River Estuary Partnership did some look at some of these Oregon tributaries and determined that for whatever reason the Sandy River was not providing the refuge anticipated, and that flows from Tanner Creek do not, under current sort of river configurations, provide sufficient input to influence the Columbia and therefore provide that refuge area. So given this, combined with the fact that most non-treaty summer steelhead impacts accrue upstream of Bonneville Dam, most of Oregon's focus is going to be upstream of Bonneville Dam. The EPA did a lot of really great work, and a lot of the physical work they did on temperatures and areas, that's pretty solid. We did have a few issues with some of the fish behavior and fisheries work that we provided comment to them on. One of the main things is that a lot of changes have happened, or actually not necessarily a lot, but some big changes have happened within the system that could impact fish behavior. EPA based much of their behavioral information on some telemetry studies that happened in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there's been a pretty major change in how we operate the hydro system and how we handle fish that encounter the hydro system. The graph here on this slide is showing when things were going on. A couple of the studies are highlighted in pink and another was in gray. And you can see that during that time period, about 80 to 90% of fish encountering the hydro system were being put in barges and barged down the river. Been a pretty major change and a de-emphasis on barging. And why this is important is stray rates have also gone down dramatically with the decrease in barging. Excuse me. And so, if you think that fish use of these areas is based on this work that happened sort of pre-barging de-emphasis, things could have potentially changed on that. Other things that are out there that can impact fish migrations are issues with fish ladder temperature differentials at the dams. Essentially, you have warmer water at the top end of the ladder and cooler water at the bottom end of the ladder, and those differentials can impede and delay the migration of fish through the system. Some of the fisheries impacts that were identified within the plan are also based either on old data or somewhat speculative in nature, so there are a few issues with those as well. However, the Coldwater Refuge concept, that idea that fish can migrate from cold water area to cold water area, isn't counterintuitive. It makes some sense. And again, as I said, we're living in this warming world, and we need to sort of be in front of this issue and not behind it. Briefly, just covering what we've done on this issue to date. The whole idea was sort of kicked off by a public workshop sponsored by the EPA in November of 2017. We've provided a couple of informational updates to the Commission through 2018 and 2019. We actually implemented a thermal angling sanctuary at the mouth of the Deschutes at the direction of the Commission in August of 2018. What we learned from that first year, I think, was important. It helped guide what we would do in future times. We heard a lot of input during the course of that fishery, and then in a public meeting in January of 2019 in the Dalles, we heard some more feedback that the boundary used in that sanctuary was larger than necessary to provide the protections we were looking for. It also impacted some fisheries on other things. And we used that input to refine the boundary. We used those refinements in 2019, and I think it had a pretty decent effect. It still provided that sort of cold water area or cooler water area at the mouth of the Deschutes, but it also allowed some fall Chinook angling that was not necessarily impacting steelhead. October of 19, EPA releases their final draft plan, and ODFW did, as I said, provide comments on those. We have not seen a final version of the plan as of yet. All right, so where do we go from here? Columbia River fisheries management is complex. It's a complex exercise in managing for weak and listed stocks of salmon and steelhead. Steelhead are particularly of interest right now, and especially when it comes to this. And so we need to take care with what we're doing, and we need to figure out how we're going to use this new information and how it can influence or impact our management decisions and those things we're doing. Again, we're going to be looking at those tributaries upstream. We've sort of covered some of the reasons about why the tributaries downstream seem to be less critical at this juncture. And then importantly, we need to know when and where specifically on those tributaries upstream of Bonneville we'd be talking. And then any boundaries that we would look to identify, we would hope could meet 4 criteria. One, that they could be easily definable in rule by staff, that they could be recognizable by anglers, enforceable by law enforcement, and then hopefully also biologically meaningful. So what to base thermal sanctuary actions on? Steelhead seem, we've talked a little bit about this right now, they've captured the imagination of a lot of people for a long time. They're a pretty special fish. They also, because of their life history, have the ability to take advantage of these thermal refuge areas. They don't spawn, they won't spawn until the following late winter or early spring. So they have time to sort of abort their or pause their migration up the river and take advantage of these thermal sanctuaries that fish like Chinook or sockeye do not. Those fish have a body clock and they need to move through the system. If they delay too long, they're not going to be successful. So steelhead seem to be really something to focus on when looking at these thermal sanctuary areas. Fisheries management, again, is complex, and we need to try to figure out a way to simplify some of the decision making so that we're not paralyzed by this sort of analysis questions that are out there, and that also our angling public can understand what we're doing, when we're doing it, and how we're doing it. So steelhead seem to be the thing. There are multiple strains of summer steelhead. However, one has been of particular concern of late, and that is the B-run steelhead. You can see here, while overall numbers are declining, the B-run numbers have been particularly low of late. So it seems like maybe we should address or use that as one of our triggers. But you want to be able to take into account both of these summer steelhead stocks, the A-run and B-run. And it turns out that generally you don't see a year when B-run are big and A-run are small. There's a pretty decent trend between the two. So it seems like basing our decision off of B-run steelhead could be a decent trigger. When would we potentially want to take these thermal sanctuary actions? We're thinking using sort of a defined temporal space. If you look at sort of average temperatures over the last decade or so, you see that really temperatures are warming at Bonneville to a degree where we would want to start doing that around July 15th. And at the same time, that happens to be about the time when those refuge areas, those temperature differentials have set up at all of the different places we're talking about. So not only are temperatures warmer, but the differentials are there in all the places. Why not just use a temperature trigger outright? Temperatures are pretty variable, both across years and within years. And I don't think we want to be in a spot where we're opening and closing these spaces on a potentially daily basis. That would be difficult for anglers, difficult for managers, and I think would detract from everybody's experience and be less useful for the fish as well. What actions should we take? Having something laid out in advance that helps guide the decision-making process, I think, will be important. We have sort of this conceptual matrix here. It's not a finished product, but it's pretty well formed at this point. Basically, we take that forecast abundance of those wild bees in advance of the season, and then we use that to guide our decision. Are we going to use a thermal sanctuary? Are we going to use additional measures or extensive closures? We've started looking at this. We think if numbers are going to be quite robust, maybe above the 70th percentile of the last 35 years on that, maybe we're not using any additional restrictions. On average years, we would be talking about thermal angling sanctuaries for some of those areas upstream of Bonneville Dam. A below average year, we would have those sanctuaries plus maybe additional fisheries management measures. And then in a year where we're well below average, we would probably have those sanctuaries plus extensive steelhead retention closures. I think it's important to note, sorry about that. The wheel on the mouse is a dangerous thing. I think it's important to note that we are always managing our fisheries to within our ASA constraints, and that we have the ability through emergency action to take additional measures based on in-season physical conditions and/or other updates, run sizes or whatnot. So we have an idea of where we're going and an idea of what we're doing that people can count on and use to hopefully plan. But if we get to a situation like 2015 where temperatures increase dramatically and rapidly and early, we have the ability to take additional actions within season. So where to take actions? Again, we've talked about this a couple of times, but just to reiterate, most of the non-treaty steelhead impacts accrue upstream of Bonneville Dam. And this is also where we see those tributary mouths that are both large enough and have temperature differentials great enough to set up those refuge areas. There are 4 of those on the Oregon shore. However, due to the depth profile and sort of the large alluvial fan at the mouth of the Hood River, it really sort of precludes its use as the sort of Coldwater refuge area that some of the other places do. And that leaves us looking then at Eagle Creek, Herman Creek, and the Deschutes River. Eagle Creek is the most downstream of the 3 locations we're looking at. It is sort of immediately upstream of Bonneville Dam, downstream of Cascade Locks. Here's an aerial photograph of the area in general. This is the I-84 bridge, a train bridge, and the eastbound bridge. Here you can see that that Eagle Creek is generally colder than the main stem throughout most of the summer. Definitely as you sort of get to those warming to suboptimal temperatures, you have that differential set up there. How does that look within the physical structure of the creek? This is some modeling information that exists out there, thermal imaging. You can see that, you know, further in the creek you get, it's cooler. As you start to progress out to the main stem, those differentials are decreasing. And what will we look at as potential boundaries if we were going to use this as a sanctuary area? We would propose initially to put markers on the upstream and downstream ends of the banks, and then run a line out through a red navigational aid, red number 4, and then down. This covers most of the area of the plume, and I think it meets most of the criteria we talked about. It would be definable, recognizable by anglers, enforceable by law enforcement, and because it's covering most of the Coldwater area, I think also hopefully biological meaningful. This would run all the way up through to the deadline near the fish hatchery, which is just up here off the map. The next area we're talking about is Herman Creek. Herman Creek is just upstream of Cascade Locks. It's in the middle of the 3 areas we're talking about. It enters the Columbia River here. It's protected from the main stem by a jetty, and there is a decent sized lagoon in this area. Water temperatures at Herman Creek are quite cool, and they spread throughout the lagoon. Because of this jetty and the headland on the upstream end, it actually provides quite a decent amount of cold water area within there. I think it's also important to note that there is a disabled and youth angling area at Herman Creek. And so any potential areas we would talk about using would leave that open to youth and disabled anglers. The boundaries there would include everything east of the Herman Creek Peninsula would be closed during the July to September timeframe, July 15 to September 15. Everything within the lagoon would be closed. And then from a marker on the Oregon shore north to the jetty tip would be the boundary on the outside edge. Definable, recognizable, enforceable, still allows youth and disabled anglers a chance to access that ramp and area there. The last area we're talking about and looking at is the Deschutes River mouth. This is our most upstream area we're talking about. It's in the Dowell's Pool. The other 2 are in the Bonneville Reservoir. And as identified by the EPA, it's the last current cold water refuge on that upstream migration corridor. You can see again, as temperatures warm and the temperature profile sets up for that differential, still lining up again with our date profile. What does the thermal plume here look like? Not as cold as some of the other areas. Again, the Deschutes River is an interior basin river. It's flowing through a longer stretch. It's a bigger input, so more opportunity for solar radiation to affect it. There is a mixing tower also now at Lake Billy Chinook, which can influence temperatures in the Deschutes. It's not as cold as it once was, but especially as you get into that mid-July and into August period, as you recalled from that previous graph, that temperature differential does still set up in that area. Not to the extent it might have prior to those releases, but definitely still there. And then this is actually the refined boundary that we put in place in 2019. The original boundary went from this range marker directly down to this red marker. We moved this in. It still captures nearly all of the cool water, but allows some fall Chinook angling to occur outside in areas that are not necessarily impacting the cool water refuge area. It also includes an area inside the mouth upstream to Moody Rapids that it would be closed to all angling. This seems to work pretty well, and given that, again, de-emphasis on barging, most of the out-of-basin encounters we see there actually occur in this very downstream area. Excuse me. What are some other potential management actions that exist out there? Here are some we've used or considered in the recent past for both recreational and commercial non-treaty fisheries. Reduced bag limits, rolling retention closures for recreational fisheries, some river-wide retentions, no boat limits or the party limit rule. We've used or considered that, although not a lot lately. Thermal angling sanctuaries, and then just some outright mainstem angling closures. For the commercial fishery, we have shifted opener timing. We've reduced the number of openers or canceled them. We've reduced the duration or the open period or reduced soak times and used some gear restrictions and outright closures again on the commercial side. Do these management actions also have a potential effect? Here's some data from our fall creel survey in Zone 6 for the Deschutes River area. This is not specific to the closure areas, but includes samples from boat ramps both at Heritage Landing in the Deschutes and from Solilo Park, which is downstream a couple of miles. And these are the sort of two major sampling points for this area. In 2016, there was a one steelhead bag limit in place, and we saw a decent amount of effort and handle, both for hatchery and for wild fish. In 2017, we had rolling retention closures in the Dalles Reservoir and in the Deschutes up to that Moody Rapids boundary from September 1 to September 30. We saw a large decrease in steelhead handle, and we did see a reduction in effort, but not a dramatic effort. In 2018, we implemented the first thermal angling sanctuary using sort of the commission guidance of something equal to or similar to the commercial, the tribal treaty commercial sanctuary boundary there. Steelhead handle was still very low when we did that, but effort also went down dramatically in the area because those Chinook fishing areas were essentially closed off by that boundary. In 2019, we had rolling retention closures from August 1st to September 30 in that area, and then we implemented the thermal angling sanctuary again in from August through mid-September. And what we see again is pretty low handle numbers for those fish, but a decent increase in the number of rebound in the effort there. So we know that some of the actions we have, the rolling retention closures, they can have an effect on reducing steelhead. The effect of the sanctuaries, I think, on steelhead handle is less clear, but we do know that by refining that boundary, we were able to still keep steelhead handle very low, but also allow access to some of the more abundant fall chinook runs that are out there. I think, heard claims that people continue to target steelhead retention in those areas during times when steelhead retention is closed and the sanctuaries are not in place. But we don't have a lot of evidence to support that, and it's not that we haven't been looking. So, sort of wrapping up tonight, again, climate change is a real and pressing issue that is currently challenging and will continue to challenge fish and fisheries management into the future. The thermal angling sanctuaries are a means to provide additional potential protections to summer steelhead. But I think we need to balance those protections with other fisheries and management needs, including, doing some interjurisdictional coordination with our other management partners. How, if we put these into effect, is it going to impact other areas if similar actions are not being taken? We just see effort shifts, and would any potential benefits you've accrued go away through that? Will they also adopt similar means? We don't know, but that's something that needs to still be done. We do plan to use these sort of areas and that rubric for a foundation for potential temporary rules as we move through the season setting process in 2020. And we do want feedback on this proposal. And as I said at the beginning, we do plan to provide additional in-person meetings on this topic in the future. So that's the presentation for today. Happy to take questions at this time. Don't be alarmed. I would say if your exact question isn't read, if several similar questions come in, we may sort of address those in a batch sort of fashion. Also, just for the record, please keep questions appropriate and on topic. Those questions that have inappropriate content or are off topic will not be read. It's likely we may not get to or be able to answer everyone's questions tonight. If that is the case, please send an email to the email on the screen, odfw.commission@state.or.us, or to one of the email addresses in the press release announcing this, and we will do our best to get back to you. And with that, I think we can take questions.
Okay, Tucker, please repeat the question. Can you describe what benefit the 2019 boundaries had on steelhead compared to years prior?
So the question was, can we describe what benefit in 2019 the thermal angling sanctuary boundary at the Deschutes had compared to years prior? The answer to that is we don't have an exact measure of the benefit of these areas. Certainly we don't at this time. These are areas that are an additional precautionary approach. Having these areas closed are certainly not harmful to steelhead. Climate change is an issue that we need to address and deal with and be in front of. And there are times when you need to take actions, even if you can't measure the exact benefit. And this is what I was talking about when I mentioned balancing the response, trying to provide these potential additional protections while also still providing for opportunity for more abundant resources. I would say that, again, we are in a period of time when, especially these wild bee steelhead numbers are not very high, so taking a precautionary approach is not unwarranted.
So no more right now, so maybe we'll hang out for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So,
We can take questions for a period of time at this point in time. I'm happy to wait and see if there are any additional questions that show up.
There's a question.
okay. Can you speak to how Columbia Coldwater Refugio might relate to lower Snake River dams? How would removing the dams decrease the need for the refuges?
So the question was, can I speak to how removing the lower four Snake River dams might reduce the need for these cold water refuge areas? That's an interesting question. The reservoirs throughout the system, including the Columbia and the Snake, are solar sinks, really, for the river water. So they provide greater surface area, they absorb a lot of solar radiation, and that contributes to increasing temperatures throughout the system. Most of the cold water refuge areas we're talking about now are quite a ways downstream from there. And so I think having these areas in a warming world can still serve a potential benefit. Certainly if migration times were increased, so if those dams were removed, and I'm neither advocating for or against that position at this time, but it would both increase the speed of juveniles migrating out and decrease the amount of time it would take for adults returning. So that could be a potential change, but I still think having these areas is not I don't think that would necessarily negate the need for these areas, but highly speculative.
So, question, is ODFW planning on implementing a quantifiable assessment of the proposal on the viability of summer steelhead prior to adoption? And please repeat the question. So, again, planning on implementing a quantifiable assessment of the proposal on the viability of summer steelhead prior to adoption.
So the question is, ODFW planning on implementing a quantifiable assessment of the viability of summer steelhead prior to putting these in place? This feels like two separate questions. One, is this are we going to try to put into place the benefit of a way to quantifiably measure the benefit of these thermal angling sanctuaries? And then also, are we going to be looking at what's going on and the viability associated with those summer steelhead? I would say we don't have a way right now to measure in a quantifiable fashion the benefit of these areas. I don't think that should preclude us in looking at them. I think we will look for those ways and start to try to do that. I think not just ODFW, but the region at large is very concerned with summer steelhead out of the Snake River. And I know that, co-managers from Oregon and Washington and Idaho and the Columbia River treaty tribes are all looking at that, and that's a big issue, as well as the federal government.
Okay, Les Kipper, can you adjust the selective tower at Refuge to make the Deschutes cooler during July, August?
So the cooling tower at the Deschutes is being operated to make the river act more like a natural interior basin river. It is also already in a way that it is cooler, right? I mean, if you think about, and let's see if we can scroll back up to this. Here's the thermograph at the Deschutes. You can see that there is already a temperature differential of greater than 2 degrees Celsius during this time period in question.
Okay, and can you explain explain why Washington Fish and Wildlife is not implementing these measures on their trips above Bonneville?
No. We have talked with Washington about this. They have lots of also management issues going on, and I don't know. I know that they have looked at some of this, and they may do some of this, but do have very little sway over actually implementing policy in Washington.
Okay, when would these proposed regulations go into effect?
So we would be, so again, what we're looking at here,
Repeat the question.
sorry, when would, the question is, when would these proposed regulations go into effect? So these, we're talking about summer and fall regulations for 2020. There are sort of two questions embedded here. I think, as I mentioned before, given where we're at and how we're hosting this meeting today, we would be dealing with this in temp rule. So those would be, again, in place based on steelhead forecasts. Those thermal angling sanctuaries would be in place July 15th through September 15th under temporary rule. We are still interested in and need to have this sort of more complete public process that involves meetings where everyone can get to. Everybody has a chance to provide the input that they want and then bring that to the commission for their consideration for permanent rulemaking later. So temporary rulemaking would be in place for this summer and fall. Permanent rulemaking would be sometime in the future after the current pandemic subsides.
Okay, we've got a question. Why not just close to all steelhead retention? And please repeat the question.
The question is, why not just close to all steelhead retention? The answer is, we might do that. These angling sanctuaries are not just closures to retention, though. They're angling closure areas. So this is above and beyond that. There's nothing, though, that precludes us from closing all steelhead retention. Haven't fully worked through all the summer's fishery modeling and planning. Don't know if it will require outright steelhead retention closures or something similar to what we've done the last couple of years, rolling retention closures. That process is ongoing as well.
What will ODFW be doing about working with Washington to address conservation concerns at Coldwater, Refuge, at the Wind, Little White Salmon, and Big White Salmon rivers?
Again, Columbia River
Please
fishery.
repeat the question.
All right. The question is, what will ODFW be doing about working with WDFW to address conservation concerns at Coldwater Refuge areas at the Wind, Little White Salmon, and Big White Salmon rivers? Again, here, Columbia River fisheries are complex interjurisdictional fisheries. When we work and set fisheries, it's a joint process with our co-managers. So we'll be talking with them about that. But I think, as I previously stated, Oregon, at least as of today, does not have management authority in Washington waters.
Okay, is ODFW concerned with further concentrating angling effort following the closures to more acute impacts in remaining fisheries?
The question is ODFW concerned with further concentrating angler effort following the closures leading to more acute impacts in remaining fisheries? I think that these sort of effort shifts are definitely a potential. These are things we'll have to work with our co-managers in Washington about. If you've closed an area adjacent to the Columbia and fisheries just move downstream or to other areas, like say the Klickitat or Little White Salmon or Wind River, that's something that we'll have to assess the effect of. And we can do that through an iterative process. I think the question was also here as I look, speaking specifically within the Deschutes. I think that's possible, but part of the reasoning on this current boundary at the Deschutes is that downstream of Moody is where most of the out-of-basin impacts seem to accrue, and upstream of there, fewer out-of-basin encounters are occurring. There are still definitely hatchery production programs within the Deschutes. We want people to have access and be able to catch those fish.
Okay, question, how would these proposed closures affect tribal fishing, particularly at Herman Creek? So again, how will it impact tribal fishing at Herman Creek? Just repeat the question.
The question was, how will these proposed closures impact tribal fisheries, specifically at Herman Creek? These are for non-treaty recreational fisheries, the closures that we're talking about. Some of these areas have existing treaty commercial sanctuaries, for instance, outside the mouth of the Deschutes that are more restrictive, but these definitely are only looking at non-treaty recreational fisheries.
Okay, here's a question. Will there be an increased presence from enforcement during these proposed times? And how will budgets address this if they've already been set? So again, the first question is, will there be an increased presence from enforcement?
The question was, will there be an increased presence from enforcement if these areas are in place? I don't supervise the Fish and Wildlife guys for Oregon State Police. My guess is that those guys will, so this is again purely a guess, they are going to be where they think the need is most. So they may be here or they may be there, but I don't anticipate an increased enforcement presence in terms of numbers of officers, but maybe if they feel like there's an issue, they would focus on an area for a little while.
Here's a new question. Are the waters in the Columbia outside of the Wind, Drano Lake, and off of the Big White Salmon jurisdictional waters, or are they Washington waters? So again, Columbia outside of the Wind, Drano Lake, and off Big White Salmon, jurisdictional waters or Washington waters?
So the question is, are the waters in the Columbia outside of the Wind, Drano, and off the Big White Salmon? I think they meant interjurisdictional waters, or are they Washington waters? In general, those areas would be managed jointly, and if there was a joint process, we could do something there, but specifically and similarly to sort of the area off the Deschutes, those would be north of the state line, I believe, in general.
And we're good with questions now, so I think why don't we wrap it up and maybe we can hang out a little bit and chat with people who have questions for maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Well, the live stream will stay live.
Okay.
The live chat's only available
Okay.
while it's live.
So do you want to?
We go to Tucker, you want to hang out and wait for some more questions?
Here's a question. Idaho is still fishing on B-Run steelhead. Can you comment on management consistency to protect the stock of fish driving this proposal?
I and my co-managers in Washington can do. So the question here is, Idaho is still fishing on B-Run steelhead at the time of this. Can you comment on the management consistency to protect the stock of fish driving this proposal? Not really sure that this is actually on topic, but I would say that we do what we can to make sure that we are operating our fisheries within our ESA and catch balancing constraints. We have taken pretty aggressive actions. We continued the closures upstream of McNary Dam through the Oregon and Washington state line through, I think, April 30 or March 31. I don't have that off the top of my head. We took some pretty aggressive actions last year to provide those protections, and we thought it made sense to continue those. Idaho is sort of the end user, I guess, of this, and so they have a real, I guess, close relationship to knowing when their broodstock needs are met. They felt that those needs had been met and had opened up some fisheries. I do know also that some of those fisheries actually help them collect some of the broodstock for those hatchery programs. So part of that is important on that aspect as well.
So we're done, so can you just restate how people can comment and next steps in the process for this?
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in tonight. We will be, as I said, using this through the temporary rule process in 2020 and fisheries planning over the next couple of weeks. We would like your input through that process. We would like your input on what we've provided tonight. Please feel free to send that to the email address that's up on the screen right now, or to myself or John North, whose email addresses were in the press release. And then also, I would welcome and hope for people's engagement through what will hopefully be an upcoming public process once we all sort of return to our regular scheduled daily lives. And thank you all.